Hey, what's going on, APUSH peeps? We got a good video for you today. This one is so important for Period 7 and this course. I would be familiar with every single thing mentioned in this video. This one is on the New Deal. Huge ramifications during the 1930s and even through today. All right, so let's get started with big ideas before the New Deal. We have laissez-faire of the 1920s, where the government pretty much took a hands-off approach to the economy. In October of 1929, we have the stock market crash, which caused a run on banks or failure of many banks. The bonus army of 1932 was when a bunch of military veterans protested to get their bonus, and Hoover disbanded this military by force. And roughly 1/4 of banks failed prior to FDR becoming president. So that's really going to be the number one issue with FDR becoming president, is the failure of so many banks across the country. So FDR's first few days in office of March 1933. Well, he is inaugurated on March 4th. Here he is with outgoing President Herbert Hoover. And he declares a national bank holiday. And he closed banks for several days to try to calm people's feelings regarding these run on banks. The Emergency Banking Relief Act allowed for the president to reopen good banks when they could prove that they were in fact good enough to be in business. And then he issued a series of what's known as fireside chats. These would be weekly radio addresses to help restore public faith in banks throughout the country. So FDR's New Deal, what does the curriculum say? It says it attempted to end the Great Depression by using government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. So the big things I want you to think of are these three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And this is from 7.1, Roman numeral 3, letter A, or page 76 of the curriculum. So there are two New Deals you should be familiar with. The first one is from 1933 to 1935, and this is going to focus primarily on relief and recovery, trying to get out of the Depression, fix the immediate causes. The second New Deal will go from 1935 to 1938 and will focus primarily on reform, or fixing or changing the role of the government in the economy and trying to avoid another Great Depression. So let's jump over to relief. The goal was to provide jobs and help end suffering. This is short term. So some examples of programs you should be familiar with is the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, which provided jobs mostly to young men between ages 18 and 24. These young men were put to work and then sent a portion of their income back to their families to help them out. And they worked on environmental work such as planting trees, building parks, etc. And they worked in segregated camps. One of the things we're going to see with the New Deal is it really does not address the issue of segregation and discrimination towards African Americans. More relief programs you should be familiar with. You have the PWA, or the Public Works Association. This provided $4 billion to state governments to build schools, roads, and highways. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, this was the largest of the New Deal programs, and it employed 9 million workers nationwide. They also built roads, bridges, and the LA Observatory. And if you've ever played Grand Theft Auto 5, you should be familiar with this building. So recovery, the goal was to improve the economy, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, sought to limit the production of crops. If you remember, farmers were overproducing crops, thus driving the price down. So this is actually going to pay farmers not to grow crops in hopes to raise the prices and help farmers out. And this is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court case Butler versus the United States. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration. This allowed the president to set codes for industries such as prices, working hours, etc. Really allows the president to take a hands-on approach to businesses, and this will be declared unconstitutional in Schechter Poultry versus the United States. We'll talk about those two court cases more in a little bit. So jumping over to reform, the goal of this is to reform the economy and prevent another Great Depression. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, is an example. If you go to a bank or a credit union, make sure you see this symbol in that building. This guaranteed bank deposits up to $5,000 at that time. Today, I believe it's around $250,000. And this is going to help restore faith in banks. So if a bank went bankrupt or failed or closed, the federal government would ensure the savings of an individual up to $5,000 at that time. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, still around today, sought to protect the stock market from fraud. So they will investigate people who abuse the stock market. Social Security, one of the biggest reform acts passed during the New Deal, provided unemployment insurance to individuals and pensions for retired workers. So how is the government going to pay for most of these programs? Well, they go into something called deficit spending. Please circle this for me. This is spending more than the government brings in. So the government purposely spends more money than they bring in. And this is known as priming the pump, and the idea that the government will spend more money in hopes to help stimulate the economy. He got this idea from John Maynard Keynes, a British economist that heavily influenced FDR. So there were some people that pushed Roosevelt towards more change. They didn't feel the New Deal went far enough. You have people like Dr. Francis Townsend, who advocated for a pension plan. This is going to influence the creation of Social Security. Huey Long, a senator from Louisiana, proposed providing $5,000 to every family by taxing the wealthy. And there are also groups that sought to limit the New Deal scope, or limit the power and size of the government under the New Deal. You have the Supreme Court. They declared the AAA and the NRA unconstitutional. They said that the federal government overstepped its power. Conservatives in Congress as well. Please star this for me. Please be familiar with people like Robert Taft of Ohio. And some conservative Democrats sought to limit the New Deal. And we'll see in 1938, Democrats are going to lose House seats, and there will be more Republicans in Congress that will push back against the New Deal and its programs. So after the Supreme Court declares some of these programs unconstitutional, FDR is going to come up with what's known as the court packing plan. And he sought to influence the Supreme Court. So his proposal was for every judge over 70 that does not retire, he could appoint a new judge. And that currently at the time was 6 new judges. And remember, one of the powers of the president is to appoint new judges. So this would allow him to appoint up to 6 new judges and increase the size of the Supreme Court up to 15. This never ever happens due to public outcry. So a lot of people thought, you know what? FDR, you're kind of acting like a dictator. You're abusing your power and trying to increase the power of the federal government too much. We need a separation of power, or to go back to checks and balances. So this never happens, although FDR pushes for it. So be familiar with this court packing plan. So Native Americans and the New Deal, we have the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This essentially reversed the Dawes Act of 1887, which encouraged individuals to own land. And this sought to have tribes collectively own land. So this is going to reverse the assimilation policies under the Dawes Act of 1887. When we're talking about African Americans in the New Deal, by 1935, 1/4 of African Americans were receiving government assistance. Roosevelt did not push to make lynching a federal crime or end poll taxes. So a lot of that Jim Crow segregation, discrimination, violence was still around in the 1930s, and FDR did not really push to end this. Segregation existed within the camps of the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, and relief agencies paid African Americans and other minority groups less than whites in certain areas. So if you were an African American on government relief, you could get paid less than whites of the same program. In 1936, African Americans are overwhelmingly going to vote for Roosevelt and Democrats. Please star that. We're going to see a shift from African Americans voting in overwhelmingly large numbers for the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. So women in the New Deal, we see Frances Perkins. She becomes the first female cabinet member of a presidential administration. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, was known as his eyes and ears of his administration. Most women did not receive government jobs. They went to men above women. And there was this belief that in economic downturns, men, not women, should have the most jobs. So what are some impacts of the New Deal? Well, it did not end the Depression. That's going to be World War II, which we'll talk about in the next video. Reforms are still around today, such as Social Security, FDIC, SEC, etc., other reform programs. And perhaps a major impact of the New Deal is political realignment. You see it underlined. Please star and circle this for me, please. What we see is African Americans and working class communities supported the Democratic Party in large numbers. So we see a shift, this political realignment or political shift in which African Americans and working class communities support the Democrats and vote for Democrats in very large numbers. So some positives and negatives of the New Deal. If you are asked to write an essay evaluating the success of the New Deal, some positives you could discuss are restoring faith and optimism, especially in the banking system, provided millions of jobs for unemployed Americans, and programs are still around today. Again, Social Security and FDIC, SEC, other programs. Some negatives are that unemployment still persisted throughout the 1930s. World War II is ultimately what's going to help end the Depression, not the New Deal, and it did not address segregation or discrimination in this country. All right, guys, for some test tips, multiple choice and short answer, know that there are groups that sought to expand or limit the New Deal and be able to identify and explain those. Political realignment of the New Deal, who was now voting for Democrats. And short answer on two interpretations of the New Deal. You can see one historian arguing in favor of it, one historian arguing against it, and you have to provide evidence to support both sides. For essays comparing the New Deal with another time period, perhaps the Progressive Era or the Great Society, which we'll talk more about in period 8, or analyzing the extent to which the New Deal fostered change in government or society, something along those lines. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you back here for video number 50, World War II. Best of luck on all your exams, especially the one in May, and have a good day.